Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books. Out loud. While stoned. In this video, we're going to do part 2 of Little Blue Book number 1060, titled The Futility of Belief in God, written by Joseph McCabe, copyright 1926. So, we're going to do chapters 3 and 4 in this video. And chapter 3 is Does Evolution Exclude God? And chapter 4, The Voice of Conscience. So, let's begin. Page 24 is where we will start off. There we go, page 24. Chapter 3. Does evolution exclude God? Here we come at once to the great question, which agitates the religious world in America. Does evolution undermine or destroy the belief in God? Let us consider it very patiently and very frankly. Certain men of science in the United States go about loudly proclaiming that evolution is quite consistent with religion. It is quite useless to try to settle the question that way. Professor Osborne and Professor Milken have every right to tell any person whom it may interest. It does not interest me, because I know that they have never studied philosophy or religion, that they believe both in evolution and religion. But they have no right whatever to say this in the name of science, for as we shall see later, the great majority of men of science and evolutionists do not believe in God. Just a word about this conflict of religion and science. Science, as such, is never concerned with religion. No branch of science deals with God or the soul or Christ. Yet there is a deadly conflict, because science tells us a large number of truths which, in the opinion of the majority of highly educated people, are inconsistent with the belief in God and the soul. Let us add again that this is mere folly to propose on that account to exclude evolution and science from the schools. The facts of history, in short, all the facts about nature and man, which we now know, are just as inconsistent with religion. In order to understand the clash, let us glance at the history of it. Atheism began long ago in ancient Greece, and religious thinkers like Socrates worked out the argument that the order and beauty and purposefulness of nature proved the existence of a God. That controversy was suspended by Europe passing into the Dark Ages, but after the Renaissance, men began to think again, and the old issue returned. If you have read The Revolt Against Religion, Little Blue Book number 1007, which is in this collection of videos, you will remember that modern skepticism began with a group of men whom we call deists. They rejected the Christian religion, but they believed in God, and they turned again to the old proofs of God's existence and developed them. Atheism was arising once more. To cut a long story short, by the middle of the 19th century, there was a whole library of books proving that the order of the heavenly bodies, the beauty of nature, and the remarkable contrivances by means of which animals and plants maintained their lives pointed triumphantly to the existence of a supreme intelligence and designer. Science seemed to be full of evidence for God. Then came Charles Darwin. What a tremendous splash that quiet little man made in the religious world. Yet Darwin never attacked religion. Indeed, if he were not such a great and good man, I should say that he was rather cowardly about it. He believed sincerely in God, at the time when he wrote The Origin of Species, and although he came some years later to reject the belief, it was difficult to get him to speak on the subject. He was a delicate and retiring man, and he looked on with some bewilderment when the brilliant Professor Huxley and my equally high-minded, if not equally gifted friend, Professor Haeckel, proceeded to show that evolution made an end of God and the soul. There had been evolutionists before Darwin, and Darwin's particular theory of how evolution was brought about is by no means generally accepted today, though it is not honest to represent this as a doubt about the fact of evolution itself. But Darwin's name is forever and deservedly associated with evolution because he put it on a very solid basis of facts and drew the attention of the world to it. And it was at once apparent that it had a most serious bearing on religion. As I said, the religious literature of the first half of the 19th century was full of proofs of God's existence drawn from the remarkable structures and instincts of animals and the wonderful adaptations of plants to their surroundings. Look how wonderfully the deep-sea fishes are adapted to life at the bottom of the sea, the desert shrubs to the scarcity of water in the desert, the alpine flowers to the cold of the mountains, the mammals to the low temperature of the north, the reptiles to the warmth of the tropics, and so on. Every organ of every organism was an eloquent, a proof of a divine artificer, as the parts of a watch are of the watchmaker. It opened up an entirely new world. It made theologians shudder when evolutionists began to show that all these things were gradually evolved during tens of millions of years. If these structures had come into existence all of a piece, certainly we should have to admit a creator. But if they were evolved gradually, one crude form leading to another, the whole situation is changed. Unconscious nature may do, by many trials and errors in a million years, what it certainly cannot do in a year. Moreover, several theories of the way in which this evolution could be brought about naturally, without any design in advance or any supernatural guidance, have been put forward by scientific men, and whether you followed Darwin, Weismann, or Mendel, or de Vries, the real Mendelist leader, the effect in abolishing design is the same. All three, Darwin, Weismann, and de Vries, were agnostics. That is how evolution undermines religion. The basis of the religious argument from design in nature is that there is no other possible explanation of the organs and instincts of animals except a divine plan drawn up in advance. No plea for the supernatural origin of anything is valid as long as there is a possibility of a natural explanation of its origin. Even if we do not see the explanation today, we may see it tomorrow. It began to be frightfully difficult to find any sort of proof of the existence of God. Turning the page. Sometimes these pages do not want to turn. Moreover, the argument from the supposed order and beauty of the universe was equally undermined. The order had been found mainly in the movements of the heavenly bodies. Today we know not only that there is a terrible amount of disorder in the heavens, great catastrophes or conflagrations occur frequently, but evolution gives us a perfectly natural explanation of such order as there is. No distinguished astronomer now traces the finger of God in the heavens, and astronomers ought to know best. As to beauty, the beauty of flowers and birds, of shells and scenery, evolution explains it just as it explains instincts and organs. It was evolved. The argument was always very one-sided, for there is as much ugliness as beauty in nature, as much brutality and bestiality as mutual aid. We will see this later. Both are now understood, however. Nature knows nothing of order and beauty, or disorder and ugliness. It evolves without a plan. Then, man develops a sense of beauty, probably as part of his sex life, and the rose or the orchid appeals to it. We can trace their evolution, and it would now be absurd to say that the flowers were evolved in order to please man a few million years ago, or a few million years later. Thus, the entire argument of design, the greatest triumph of the theologians, fell to pieces. There have, of course, been attempts to reconstruct it, but they all contain the same fallacy. They select something that science cannot explain. The writers themselves never know enough about science to know whether it can be explained or not. And they then bring in God to explain it in the usual way. Lord Balfour, who is a clever statesman and a mere novice in science, repeats the old argument with little variation. Lord Kelvin, who was a very distinguished physicist but knew nothing about biology, was promptly snubbed by the biologists of England when he tried to find an argument for God in their science. Sir Oliver Lodge, who also is a physicist and knows nothing about biology, is disdainfully ignored by them when he tries to do the same thing. The argument for a designer is as dead as the argument for a first cause, a prime mover, a creator, or a legislator of the laws of nature. It is sometimes said, especially by Sir Oliver Lodge, that the argument can be entirely changed and restored to its full strength by admitting that natural causes produce everything, but that God guided these natural agencies. You might, for instance, trace in science the whole series of movements from the primitive nebula onward, which eventually produced the bee, with all its wonderful instincts. But, says Sir Oliver Lodge, you would not see the guidance of the natural agencies by a supernatural power. Yes, quite naturally. What Sir Oliver Lodge forgets is that he has to prove that there was such a guidance. He can only do this by proving that the guidance was necessary, that the natural agencies of evolution would not have produced the bee as we know it unless they were guided. I have repeatedly challenged him to prove this, and he has never done it, because it cannot be done. Moreover, this idea of guidance of the forces of nature, which is very popular with some, raises a score of difficulties the moment you examine it closely. How would you guide a billiard ball without pushing it? Can a mind communicate its designs to matter, and could matter carry out such designs if they were communicated? Do the atoms in the rose know that they are working out a design? In what earthly sense can anyone conceive these atoms to be guided? It is mere verbiage. These people are fond of representing the agnostic and the scientific men as superficial and themselves as profound. But just reflect for 10 minutes on this idea of guidance of the forces or elements of nature. Try to work it out. You will soon find which side it is that is superficial. And this applies in full force to what is called creative evolution, the theory of Professor Bergson, George Bernard Shaw, and a few others. One ought almost to apologize for bringing Mr. Shaw into a serious work, however small, and Professor Bergson has not and never had any support in the world of philosophy. Their theory is that, though a personal God does not exist, a sort of vital force works through matter and finds expression in the myriads of animals and plants and man. This is worse than ever. A conscious personal God might vaguely be conceived as realizing a plan through matter in a way we cannot comprehend. But when you take the vital principle itself to be impersonal, a sort of muddle-headed God at the best, and regard this vague thing as working in conjunction with conscious atoms to produce a peacock's tail or a palm, you feel like Alice in Wonderland. Sometimes theists fancy that they get rid of difficulties by sacrificing the personality of God. I don't believe in a personal God, but there must be a cosmic mind, says a lawyer to me. Another calls it a cosmic power. Another, the energy of the universe, and so on. Well, I should not regard an impersonal God as worth a grain of incense or a spot of ink. We could have no more emotion about it or practical relation to it than in the case of either. It is not worth quarreling about. But, in point of fact, many of these people do not know what personality means. It means mind or self-consciousness. And as to those who prefer to talk about a great energy or force or power, they are equally ignorant of the meaning of the words they use. In science, from which the words are taken, power, force, and energy are merely mental abstractions, not realities. There is, in fine, no aspect of nature today which even suggests the existence of God. There is a very great deal in nature, as we shall see, which suggests that there is no God, no sort of God. But before we turn to consider this, let us regard man himself and see whether this highest form of existence has any characteristics which send the mind of God. And that, I believe, is the end of chapter 3. Let me turn the page here. Yep, that's the end of chapter 3. We'll pause so I can get a drink, and then we'll go on to chapter 4. There we go. Okay, chapter 4. The voice of conscience. The sum, the sum of what we have so far seen is that in the universe at large, there is no sort of evidence of the existence of any sort of God, any sort of power or being or mind beyond or behind it. One by one, the old arguments have been discredited. There were the early philosophical arguments, the proofs of a first cause or prime mover, and so on. Modern philosophy entirely rejects them, and it is the philosophers who best know their value. Then there was the order of the heavens, and modern astronomy has made an end of this argument. The idea that such beauty as there is in nature testified to a God has been equally discredited by evolution. The argument from design has been shattered in the same way. Science gives us a natural interpretation of nature. It is very far indeed in its present stage from explaining everything, but to take some part of nature which is at present obscure and say that the hand of God must be there is a very poor fallacy. It is quite obvious that our ignorance of the natural causes may be, and in view of the history of science probably is, only temporary. A few moments' reflection will show you the fallacy of all these arguments and explain why men in their search for God have been driven by science from one department of nature to another. For such an inference to be valid, you must prove not merely that science cannot today explain this or that phenomenon in nature, but that it will never furnish a natural explanation of the phenomenon, because such an explanation is impossible. Who will venture to attempt that? No. The ordinary believer in God, and it is for him that I write, must, in his own interest, realize that popular preachers and writers deceive him, not deliberately, but owing to the limitations of their education. They use long, discredited arguments. They talk philosophy, which no philosopher will admit, and science that no scientist will recognize. If you take any million believers in God, at least 9/10 of them believe for reasons which trained thinkers regard as quite illogical, and it is merely foolish to imagine that the businessman or the popular preacher or the politician can judge the value of such arguments better than the trained thinker. Amongst the higher type of religious writers, the better educated clergy, this is sadly recognized. They do not now use the old arguments which seem on the lips of the popular preacher to be so convincing that you feel that the atheist must be a fool or a knave. They do not boast that they can demonstrate the existence of God. They admit that it is a delicate and difficult problem. The glory of God, which was once thought to fill the universe, is now regarded as a purely spiritual thing that is not reflected from a material universe. Did you ever, with a friend, argue as to whether the pale, delicate line low down on the far horizon was really a range of hills or a cloud? Did you ever see the northern lights quivering so faintly in the night sky that you were not quite sure in your own mind whether the light was there or not? For the most honest and learned believers in God, this is now the true position of the light which was once thought to flood the universe and convince every man. So new ways, new avenues are tried. Some, as I said, talk only of an impersonal power, but that does not help. Some say that God is limited in power, and we shall see later that this does not help. Some say that God is immanent in the universe, not transcendent to it or outside of it. But no church ever really said otherwise, and it is merely a new word that these modernists have coined. It is no use appealing to the universe in any way. It is godless. It is a great reality evolving slowly through the ages, with long, pretentious periods of blind clash and ferocity crowned by a relatively few years of civilization. Nobody, from Job onward, ever really reconciled its features with God. New schools of theologians abandon nature and turn to man, or abandon nature generally and concentrate on its highest product, the representative man. If we cannot find the finger of God here, where shall we look for it? There may be, on general grounds, I should say, that there probably are higher beings than man on other planets and other parts of the universe. Our life story on this globe has probably some 200 million years still to run. Other stars are older than ours, and they may have planets on which the life story has run millions of years ahead of ours. Mars even may have, I think probably has, a more advanced race than ours. Isn't that funny? 1926, they still believed that it could possibly be Martians living on Mars. But the highest thing in the universe which we actually know is man, and in his nature we ought to find something more suggestive of divine action than in stars or flowers. Moreover, he is so frail a being, and his nerves quiver so with pain, that a benevolent or merciful power may be expected to take a special interest in him. The star feels no shock when it enters a nebula or approaches another star, and its entrails are torn out and flung leagues over space. The rose has no tears when it withers. Even the animal has only a very dull glow of conscious pain. But man, I am reserving for a special chapter the reasons in nature and man for not believing in God. You will not grumble if I give a single chapter to disproofs and 5 to an account of what are regarded as proofs. But right here, it is necessary to anticipate a little. It is precisely in the case of man where we ought to find divine action, that we have least trace of it. The history of man is now written without the smallest need to introduce supernatural action. Whatever has been accomplished was accomplished by man. The prehistory of man, the millions of years of primitive savagery, is even more brutally godless. The human world today, which we know so well, nowhere suggests a finger of God. Let this wait a little. Let us take first the best that there is in man. We cannot here discuss his intellectual faculties, as their meaning and nature have to be considered in other booklets. They can only be said to point to the existence of God if they are, as some think, spiritual realities. We shall see later that, especially when we regard their slow and gradual evolution, we find no proof that they are spiritual. They are a higher development of the faculties of the lower animal. It is, naturally, the same with man's emotions. His religious emotions, in particular, we will study in the next chapter. It is in man's moral emotions, in his conscience, that theologians generally claim to find evidence of the existence of God. Whatever may be said about the moral emotions of animals, and some writers have detected the crude beginnings of a moral code amongst the higher animals, man broadly stands out from the rest of the world of life as the being with a conscience. He perceives moral law, and moral law implies a legislator. Natural laws may be mere descriptions. Moral law is a code drawn up in advance for humans to obey. Once more, we cannot give a complete reply to this until we have studied the nature of moral law. This I give in the Human Origin of Morals, Little Blue Book number 1061, the one I just did before this one. In the general books of this series, we necessarily touch many things lightly, which require a more particular treatment. I may seem at times to make statements without proof, even to the dogmatic. Have patience. Every serious point in connection with religious controversy is discussed somewhere in the series. Pardon me. A special book deals with the nature and evolution of conscience and moral law. Here, it will be enough to call attention to the weakness of the theological argument. Moral law exists, and it implies a legislator. We admit it. There are modern writers, novelists, dramatists, Nietzscheans, etc., who seem to question it, but one finds that they generally mean that some part of the accepted moral code is questionable. Let us say that the race recognizes a law of justice, honor, truthfulness, honesty, temperance, and kindness. You say that God imposed this law, and that in the voice of conscience we have the faint echo of his thunder. I say that the legislator was humanity, and that the conscience of the individual is an outcome of causation. If the facts of moral life are consistent with my theory, there is no room for yours. A supernatural explanation is superfluous when a natural explanation is possible. Why? For this simple reason. If a thing which actually exists is enough to explain a phenomenon, you have not the least guarantee of the existence of something else, otherwise unknown, which you call in to explain it. It may be more poetic to regard thunder as the voice of God, but since electricity fully explains it, you give up the idea of a God in the sky or on the mountaintop. Not every feature of moral life is dun, 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 is consistent with the theory that moral law is a code of behavior imposed on the individual by the community. The nature of the law, the clauses and precepts of it, points to this. Justice, honesty, and truthfulness are social laws, obviously. Social life improves insofar as they are observed, and it is disturbed insofar as they are ignored. Nothing can be clearer than the 9/10 of the moral code represents rules of social conduct. The evolution of morals quite confirms this. The lowest peoples of the human family have no moral ideas, as we may see, and reviewing the various tribes of savages and barbarians in succession, from the lowest level upward, we see the moral law taking shape in harmony with the needs of the expanding social life of the tribe and the nation. This is shown in detail elsewhere. Religious creeds pervert the code. Local circumstances and needs shape it differently in different places. But the general development is clear. Man gradually formulates his moral or social law. Then the priests take it over and ascribe the law to a divine legislator. It would be strange if 9/10 of the moral code were purely human, the other 10th supernatural. Yet this is, I suppose, what the argument implies. Men certainly do not need a God to teach them that justice and honesty are laws or ideals, and the different emphasis put on different clauses of the law is equally human. Lying, for instance, is regarded as a light offense. To get drunk once in a while is not a serious it's not a serious matter. To get drunk habitually and ruin your family is a crime. Murder is the greatest of crimes. It is all perfectly human. It is social law. The only difficulty is about sex morals, and precisely on this point, there is no such thing as a universal and consistent human conscience. This is plainly very significant. A few weeks ago, a cultivated Mexican gentleman told me that there are parts of his country where your host offers you the companionship of his wife for the night, and is offended if you decline. It was a virtue of hospitality in ancient Scotland and other places. Polygamy is quite moral in Turkey, and quite immoral in America. Yet even a Christian moralist like St. Augustine would allow a man to beget children by another woman if his wife was barren. There is no limit to the vagaries of conscience in the field of sex. In our own highly civilized age, the most serious writers dispute the theoretically accepted code of virtue. This is in perfect harmony with the view that moral law is human law. It is quite inconsistent with the belief that an autocratic legislator framed the law. We are in an age of transition. The Christian code of conduct contained things which were purely ecclesiastical in origin. We are now trying to separate what is really moral and social law from these sectarian ideas, and the standard of most people is a social standard. Does the act do harm to others? The golden rule is the ultimate moral principle. Behave toward others as you turning the page, there we go, as you wish them to behave toward you. Nothing could be more clearly social. So, though all this has required a more lengthy treatment elsewhere, there is no serious difficulty about the code. What most believers will say is that we cannot enforce it properly without belief in God. They say that they are concerned about the sanction, not the origin of morals. A very complete answer to this is given in The Human Origin of Morals, Little Blue Book number 1060. 1. It is proved beyond cavil that the world has steadily improved during the last 100 years, when the belief in God has been steadily decaying. I have given full and unquestionable proof of this in the recent book, A Century of Stupendous Progress, and I give a summary of the evidence in another little blue book. It cannot be seriously disputed. Ours is the most godless generation that ever yet existed, and it is the highest in character. Maybe. This is before World War II. There is nothing but pulpit rhetoric in the complaints that we are decaying and deteriorating. If moral law is social law, we shall see that it is increasingly obeyed. If any part of our moral law is not social law, it will disappear. But from the nature of the case, if it is not social law, this will have no social consequence. The moral argument for God is the feeblest of all. Moreover, it is obvious that a man must very firmly believe in God before the idea can control his moral conduct. To say that we need the belief as a sanction of morals is absurd. We cannot manufacture beliefs for practical purposes. They would be fictions and therefore ineffective. It is better to enforce the authority of man, still better so to educate the race in social feeling and an enlightened view of its own interest, that the idea of compulsion will disappear. When we have quite got rid of the autocratic theory of morals, we have every reason to expect further and greater moral progress. That is the end of chapter 4. And the end of part 2 of Little Blue Book, number 1060. The Futility of Belief in God, written by Joseph McCabe. Thanks for listening, and join me in part 3.